Recording. Okay.
And I'm muting. All right.
Well, I thank you all for coming and spending a little time on a Wednesday night with us. First thing I want to do is just welcome a few folks. We have our National Vice President, Diana Quinn, who is assisting me with this, and I greatly appreciate her doing that. Thank you, Diana. Let's see. And I know that Dave Warmer, our National Treasurer, was signed up. I don't see him in yet. And I know our Peachtree President, Rusty Duncan, was signed up. I don't see him in yet, but they might pop in a little bit later. Some ground rules for our presentation. One, I ask you to stay muted unless you're called on. That's to stop the video feed from getting controlled and grabbed off by other sounds. So please do stay muted unless you're called on. Questions are fine at any time. Ask questions via chat and put them in the chat to everybody. That way, Diana can see them and bring them to my attention. So I can't see the chat window because it's off over there, you know, on the left side. I'm going to be looking mostly straight forward. So she'll bring those to my attention when it's a good time for me to pause and answer questions. And, you know, it's okay for you to, if you see a question in chat, if it's going to be chat to everybody will see them. So if you know the answer to the question, go ahead and answer it. That'd be fine too. And in the unlikely event that we get Zoom bombed and we cannot recover, we'll terminate the session and go look at your email, because we'll immediately send out a new Zoom link, and we'll go back and do it again on a different Zoom link. Okay. All right. So those are our ground rules. Let me go ahead and get started here. So the reason that we're doing this, I'm doing kind of a sequence of HPDE 101s. And what I want to do is to interest you all in the club in coming to high performance driver education. And the last one I did was just a general orientation. This one is about the tech inspection, which can be a little bit of a stressor. I want it to make it a little less stressful. And the next one we're going to do on March 26th is going to be kind of one or maybe two classroom sessions to give you a feel for what you might learn in the classroom. But and that's the ones I have planned so far. If there's something else you'd like to see and that would make it easier for you to come to these events, let me know and I'll just plan to do it. Okay. Now, some info about me. Now, one, I'm not a professional mechanic. I don't know it all. I certainly know cars that I own the best. I did spend a number of years racing. I maintained my own race cars and those of the rest of the team as well at that time. I know the cars I own the best. I own cars from 1970 to 2008. And so I'm weaker on newer cars. And the example I'm going to use today is mostly on my 2002 CLK 55. So just to introduce the topic, all high performance driver education organizations have a requirement to have the car be inspected. And they'll have different tech inspection forms. Most of them are one page. I've seen one absolutely multiple page form. They pretty much look at the same thing, but the details might be different. And so I encourage you, when you're signing up for an event, ours or somebody else's, take a close look at the form early. Download the form. Make sure your car will pass. You want to figure that out early enough that either A, you can get your money back if you can't, make the car pass, or two, fix whatever it is that prevents your car from being able to go to the event. Now, why would the car not pass? The big picture reasons: everybody requires equal restraints. Equal restraints means the driver and the passenger have to have the same type of belting requirements. For a stock car, not an issue. Both of them are the same. If you put a 6-point harness in for the driver, the passenger has to have a 6-point harness. This is so when you have an instructor in the car, they're going to have the same amount of restraint and i.e. safety that the driver does. The other thing to be aware of is that nowadays, some organizations require, if you're going to have a harness, require a Hans device as well. So consider that when you are thinking about harnesses. And some organizations with harnesses today require the harnesses be less than 5 years old. So you end up in a situation where stock seat belts that are undamaged are okay if they're 20 or 25 years old, but the harnesses have to be less than 5 years old. Just kind of interesting. Yeah, another reason that the car might not be okay is if it's a convertible that doesn't have rollover protection. Now, Mercedes are generally fine. All Mercedes since 1990 have rollover protection, pop-up roll bars or things like that. And in fact, 107s with the hardtop installed will be fine. No one's really asked me, but I think Pagodas with the hardtop installed would also be fine. But first generation Miatas are not. They do not have rollover protection, and they'll require a roll bar or a hardtop to be okay for use in HPDE. So it kind of depends. And if you have a question about your car, contact the event organizer really early to see if your car's okay. One that kind of came up more recently that I'd never thought about, lack of seat belts and shoulder harnesses. Pre-1968 cars didn't come with seat belts and shoulder harnesses. And many people will add seat belts and not shoulder harnesses to those cars. And I think we had a car that kind of showed up that didn't have a shoulder harness. I think it was like a mid-60s Corvette. And so that's another thing to kind of be aware of. If you very seldom see a car that old come out for HPDE, but I'm expecting to see a seatbelt and a shoulder harness on each car. And so if you're in that situation, you ought to have a shoulder harness too. Now, I mentioned that the tech inspections vary, the forms vary, although the basics are going to be the same, but they also have different requirements on who can do the inspections. Some let you do the inspection yourself if you have the technical expertise to do it. MBCA is that way. Atlanta Motorsports Park itself for its members is that way. Some organizations require professionals or folks that are specifically authorized by them. And some let instructors do themselves and have those rules for everybody. So you really do want to know what the rules are for that organization, and that'll be typically in the event description or on the tech form. And some require professional garages. For newer cars, a Mercedes dealer will be a fine choice. If you're going to another professional mechanic, somebody with a performance background is a better choice than somebody that doesn't have a performance background. I mean, anybody can execute the checklist, but you really kind of want someone with understanding of what it takes to be on the track if you can. Not required, but it's better. Remember, it's in your best interest to have a good inspection for your safety on the track. And so you don't want a sleazy inspection or one that folks kind of, don't look very closely. Okay, it's in your best interest to have a good inspection. And that's why I think it's okay for you to do your own inspection. I mean, you know whether you're good enough mechanically to check the car over, and it's your safety. And so that's why we think if you have the confidence to do it, you can do it yourself. All right, so let me talk through what gets looked at and what you look for. And this is me doing an inspection on my own car, and I'm going to talk you through in a fair amount of detail what we're going to look at. And I've got a fair amount of pictures too to show you, to illustrate some points. So the first thing I'm going to pay attention to is brakes. Kind of makes sense. The brakes have got to work well if you're on the racetrack. Now, what I see, a weakness I see, is in folks not understanding that the brake fluid needs to be fresh. Now, if you look at our form, it says brake fluid changed within 6 months, and we prefer 3 months. If it's older than that, you need to change the brake fluid. Now, you may ask why that is. Well, brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means when exposed to the atmosphere, it absorbs water. And absorbing water changes its boiling point. And for example, standard DOT4 brake fluid, the dry boiling point is 446 degrees Fahrenheit. The wet boiling point, and wet means when it's absorbed as much water as it can, is 311 degrees Fahrenheit. That's quite a drop. And if you're on the racetrack, you want the higher boiling point, not the lower boiling point. Now, and there's a lot of different racing brake fluids at a lot of different price points with a lot of different boiling points. A typical racing brake fluid, one I chose, has a boiling point, a dry boiling point of 617 degrees and a wet boiling point of 401 degrees. And some drivers are going to want to use a racing brake fluid for the higher boiling point. So, more experienced drivers who are using their brakes more heavily, or higher horsepower cars. Deanna, you're probably going to want to use racing brake fluid. So changing the brake fluid is often necessary before, while you're executing this tech sheet, before you do the HPDE. Now you do this. I'm going to go and see if I can screen share here. Let's see, share. Got a picture for you here. All right, you should be seeing a picture of my CLK55 sitting up on jack stands with all the wheels off. And, my comment is, do this with all four wheels off the ground, because you're going to want to go and revisit each wheel. You really can't do this one wheel at a time. And you do this by pressure bleeding. You see my pressure bleeding apparatus hooked up here. And you need to take a look at the Mercedes procedure for doing this, because some of them are different. Some of them vary. Some of them require different pressures. 140s and 208s require that you pressurize the reservoir to 29 psi. A lot of cars, you can get away with only 15 psi. And some require that, some have a switchover valve in the master cylinder, and 140s tell you to actuate the switchover valve, and there's actually a bleeder on the master cylinder that you're supposed to bleed from, and it tells you how to activate the switchover valve. And newer cars might have a star system, a diagnostic system driven procedure where you go in to bleed the brakes, and it tells you, do this first, and then it'll be doing things like lifting various parts of the system, actuating solenoids, and telling you to bleed this one or go step on the pedal. And so you really do need to look at the procedure for your car to make sure you're doing what it says for you to do. All right. Now, the nice thing about doing it this way too, with all four wheels off the car, is it allows you to do other inspections as you're proceeding through this. And I'll point out that there are some cars that you can do a full brake bleeding and fluid change with the wheels on the car. 140s are that way, but it's very convenient to take the wheels off. For example, this picture is, I just stuck my phone in through the wheel and took a shot of the brake pad, because you're going to want to look at how thick the brake pads are. Some of the inspection sheets specify a minimum brake pad thickness, like 5 millimeters or something like that. Others use a percentage of new. But you just really need to look at it and make sure you've got enough brake pad to last the day or the weekend. Now, this is a brand new pad, and this pad is either 10 or 11 millimeters thick, but that's absolutely a brand new pad. And that was a front. This is a rear, and you can see the backing plate here, and then here, this is almost a new pad itself here. And these are easy to see, even with the wheels on. You just look through the spokes of the wheel and shine a flashlight in the right way, or use an inspection mirror, and it's easy to see these. But with the wheels off, it's even easier to see. And with the fixed calipers, you can easily see both of the pads and take a look at how thick they are. Now, let's talk a little bit about brake pads while we're on the subject. You don't want to be using, generic brake pads from, say, on the shelf at AutoZone or Advanced Auto Parts. I mean, you want either the brake pads that Mercedes spec'd for the car, or something even more hardy than that. The one thing I noticed with this CLK55 is the Mercedes AMG brake pads for the car were Ferodo brake pads. and I was able to obtain some identical Ferodo brake pads that didn't have the 3-point star on them. It cost a lot less. But and some people, or some of you will want to just go to racing brake pads. If you have a modified car with a lot of horsepower, if you're a more advanced driver and you're using the brakes more heavily, more effectively, you might want racing brake pads. Be careful with what you buy. Read very carefully the description of the pads. I got a set of pads from a company that a while back, and I thought they were for the track, and they went away almost immediately. And as I then went back and read the description, they were kind of for light track use. And so I was very unhappy about those. And I just went to full race pads, and that's what I use now. The pads I use are Porterfield R4 compound.
Gary, we do have a question in
Yeah, I
chat.
see that over there.
Ron, yeah. How do we get brake fluid change procedures for newer cars? Yeah.
Well, I would recommend you always have a copy of the Mercedes Workshop Information System. You can typically get CDs on eBay that have the Workshop Information System for not very much money. It's surprisingly inexpensive and it covers all the cars. The other thing that I find very, very useful, I mean, if you're going to have one of these cars, is get a some type of scanner that will talk to the car. And the scanner I like is the Mercedes star system. I got a Chinese clone star system, and the star system has the workshop information system in it. And so you can not only, look up how to do the procedure, but you can also go into where you're talking to the system and do, if it's a car that the procedure drives, you can have it do it for you. So I highly encourage you to get a star clone or something like that if you're going to have one of these cars. There's some other scanners too that do things like that.
Okay, well, it looks like you're talking about brake rotors here and pads. So Mel has a question about how to speak to even pad wear and rotor wear in terms of hanging calipers.
Yeah, I'm going to talk rotors in just a second. I've got a rotor picture I want to show you. You say hanging calipers. I think you probably mean floating calipers. I really don't like floating calipers, and this car has floating calipers. And with floating calipers, you have more of an issue with even pad wear and even some wedgie pad wear. So you really do want to look at the inside pads as well as you can on a floating caliper. But they're happiest with new pads. Let me put it that way. They're much happier with new pads, and as the pads wear down on any car, the brakes don't feel as good as they do with new pads. But for floating calipers, since they have to slide, the areas they slide on need to be appropriately lubricated. Not that I would take them apart when I'm doing this inspection, but when you're changing the pads, you've got on a floating caliper, you've got to look at the areas they slide on and make sure they don't have any little divots worn in them that'll cause them to hang up. I've just replaced a couple of floating calipers, and I bought a pile of used ones and then used the ones that didn't have very much wear in the areas where they have to slide. Yeah, I'm really not a fan of floating calipers, and Mercedes is using them on a number of cars, including AMG cars. Okay, well, I hope I've answered that one. Let's go to rotor, since he mentions rotor in that one. You've got to look at the rotors. And with heat, rotors will start cracking. This is technically called crazing. I just refer to it as cracking. Cross-drilled rotors are worse than others, and these can be hard to see. The best way to see this is shine a flashlight on it at an angle and to help highlight that. And that's how I got this picture. Now, what you see in this picture is unacceptable. And it's unacceptable because you've got cracks that go from one hole to the other, and you've got cracks that are pretty long. Now, I couldn't find a Mercedes tech bulletin that told me, how long the cracks could be before they're unacceptable, but it did say cracks can't connect the holes and they can't connect to the outer ring. Some other manufacturers have a length specification on this cracking, but as hot brake rotors will eventually start cracking like this, and so shine a flashlight on them and look very carefully. This is on a car I bought from someone, and he had no idea the rotors look like this. And the first thing I did was replace these rotors. Okay. So just look carefully at the rotors to see if they've got cracking going on. Now, you've got the wheels off, you've got the car up in the air. You've got to look at the hoses that connect the hard brake lines to the calipers. And what you will find on a car that's more than about 8 to 10 years old is these hoses start to get cracking in them. And it can be hard to see. It's easiest to see if you shine a flashlight at an angle. I've given you two pretty extreme examples here. The left one over here, you can see the cracking. The right one was the exterior surface was falling off. It was very obvious. But you can't tolerate cracking in these lines. And so you absolutely must change these lines. And if you know you're going to have to change the lines, do it before you change the brake fluid, because you're going to have to bleed the brakes when you change these lines. And I mentioned brake lines. Look at the hard brake lines as well. Two things to look for. Rust. You really don't want rusty brake lines. And my tow vehicle had a rusted through brake line. That was pretty undesirable. The other thing that is a little bit more subtle is there are clips where the solid lines connect to the hoses, and the clips are there to stop the solid lines from vibrating. And let's see, let me go back one with this picture, because this doesn't show the clip. It shows where the line goes through the bracket, and it's solid on this side, which means that this isn't going to vibrate. The other side has a piece of metal that goes between the hard line and this fitting. And as you tighten down on the hard line, it tensions against the clip, and it stops the metal line from vibrating. If you don't have that type of clip in place, if someone had just kind of forgot to put it in at some time, you can have some vibration on the hard lines, and they will eventually fatigue fail. I've had that happen before. Fortunately, it was an autocross. Fortunately, it was a very long straight, but it was kind of not so great getting home that night. All right, so your wheels are off. So take the opportunity to look at every suspension bushing you can see and every sway bar bushing you can see with a flashlight, and anything else you can see in the wheel well. Now you got the wheels and tires off. Look at the wheels and tires. This is a pretty extreme example of a wheel that did not, a tire that did not pass the inspection, but you're looking to see that you've got adequate rubber on the tire to last through your day or your weekend, and things like that not showing. That's cord, that's first layer of rubber gone, second layer of rubber worn through, and then some actual of the cord showing through. That's not acceptable. And of course, with the wheels, you're looking for cracks or dents. Another picture here for you. This is an ABS control module. You want to ensure that you don't have any leakage in the brake systems. You probably feel some leakage by a softer pedal, but put your hand under the ABS control module and see if it's wet, because it can be very hard to see if these are leaking or not. And the same with the master cylinder. Master cylinder is usually easier to see, but you cannot have leakage in the brake system, and so you've got to detect it and fix it. This is one reason why you want to do these inspections early enough that if you find an issue, you have time to fix it before the event. Okay, I'm going to come out of screen sharing here for a little bit. I think I am, at least. Stop share. There it is. Okay, so when you install the wheels, then once assuming you're done with your brake fluid flush and change, when installing wheels, check for free play. Now, what I do is I put the wheel on, I put all the lug bolts on, and I use a 1/2 inch drive ratchet and hold the wheels with my feet so they don't turn. And I tighten the 1/2 inch with the 1/2 inch drive ratchet. I tighten the lugs to a reasonably tight amount, as tight as I can get them. I mean, they're not torqued yet, but they're tight and they don't move on the hub. And then I check for free play. Hands in the 3 and 9 position and move the wheel, and hands in the 6 and 12 position and move the wheel. Shouldn't feel any free play. And I caution you, the 9 and 3 position free play is typically steering, but crane your head over and look at the steering wheel and see if it's moving, because you can get in a situation where you feel like there's some free play, but the steering wheel is actually just moving, and that's okay. Sometimes I put a piece of tape on the steering wheel, like masking tape, so I can see it better, so I can tell whether I'm actually moving the steering wheel and it's not really free play. Now, if it's free play, then you got to figure it out. I mean, you're not supposed to have any free play. The first thing I will do is adjust the wheel bearing. And I mean, you can tell whether you are adjusting it a lot or a little. If you're not adjusting it very much, that probably wasn't the free play. And let me point out, typically, what you're taught is that a wheel bearing with free play will have free play in both the 3 and 9 position and the 6 and 12 position. I have found that that's not always true. I have found that free play can exist in the 3 and 9 position, not in the 6 and 12 position, and still be the wheel bearing. And so I will adjust the wheel bearing first, and not very tight. You can't go very tight on these wheel bearings. There's a workshop manual procedure involving a dial indicator, which is honestly not what I do, but you got to be careful that you don't adjust the wheel bearings very tight. But you got to adjust them tight enough not to have free play. So if it still has free play, you've got to look where it is. And I'm going to go back to the screen sharing here. Okay. Some more pictures for you. And share. All right, and go to the next picture here and blow it up a little bit. This is a composite I made at the bottom of the car that I was doing this inspection on. So if you have play in the 3 and 9 position, that's usually going to be steering. There's a lot of components in the steering. Get into the car, get someone else to do the wiggling of the wheel for you, and visually observe where the play is. I mean, you can go, it can be the outer tie rod end, the inner tie rod end, steering box itself, where it attaches to the drag link, the other end of the drag link, the idler arm, the inner tie rod on the other side, the outer tie rod on the other side. So you can typically tell which one it is. I was doing a tech inspection on a SL500 one time, and I found that the outer tie rod end was bad, and I didn't have many days before the event, but that was a pretty quick tie rod change. And one thing I'll point out is that this idler on 124s, 208s, on a lot of cars, if you have play on the right side and not the left side, it's very often this idler arm bushing, and they're inexpensive and easy to change. And it's pretty obvious. You can see when you have play there. Okay. Also check the rear. Rear play is very unusual. If you have play in the rear, you've got almost certainly have a bad rear wheel bearing, and you really need to change that, and that's a pain. Now, you've got the wheel on, and you've got it elevated, so roll it and just listen to it and feel it to see that the wheel bearing is okay. I have not seen very many problems with Mercedes wheel bearings. If they're not stock wheels, consider whether the lug bolts are actually correct or not. And if you've got a stock Mercedes AMG car with the stock wheels on it, this is not going to be an issue. If someone has swapped to a different type of wheel and you're doing this car for the first time, think about this. There's so many different wheels with different thicknesses and so many different lug bolt lengths that it is possible to end up with a lug bolt that doesn't have adequate thread engagement so that it will not hold the wheel on well enough. How do you check this? If the wheel is off the car, just stick the lug bolt in the wheel and see how far it protrudes where it bolts into the hub. What you need is 5 threads. So count 5 threads. If you've got 5 threads, you're fine. If the wheel's on the car, pull one of the lug bolts out. Feel where it starts to engage as you're threading it. Mark it. Count how many turns. And just make sure it's got 5 turns. Because otherwise, if you don't know the car and you just got the car, don't take it for granted that you've got lug bolts on that are long enough to hold the wheels on. You need 5 turns. Okay, and my wife just walked in. I was asking her that. Okay. And now that we've got the wheels on the car, we put the car on the ground and we torque the wheels to the required torque. And look that up. You have to you need a high range torque wrench to do this. And I'm going to mention that if you go to a PCA event, Porsche Club of America, and they do a wonderful job on HPDE. I thoroughly encourage you, if you don't have one of our events, and we don't do very many events, if you have a PCA event around, go to a PCA event. They're very focused on checking lug nut, lug bolt torque at grid tech the day of the event. And most of the Porsches use 19mm headed lug bolts, lug nuts. Most of the Mercedes use 17mm headed lug bolts. So what I do, and the torques are different too. Their torques are either 95 or 111 foot-pounds, and your torques are either 81 or something higher, but not as high as theirs because the bolts are smaller. What I normally do is carry a torque wrench with the right socket and the right extension on it, set to the right torque for my car. I carry it over to Grid Tech, and when they decide they want to check the torque, I just hand it to them. And that way they don't have to look for a different socket or look up a car that they're totally unfamiliar with and potentially over torque your wheels or something like that. So just be aware of that. But part of one thing you always have to force yourself to do is, as soon as a car gets on the ground, torque the wheels to the required torque. It's you don't want to send a car out on the racetrack with the lug bolts not torqued. Trust me, I've done that before once. You don't ever want to do it again. Okay, well, I'm going to shift to engine compartment here. And let's see, we'll go to a different picture. Now, that was the idler arm bushing I wanted to mention to you. Okay, so we're going to look in the engine compartment, and then I'm going to go back under the car. Now, in the engine compartment, well, you're obviously looking for leaks. Now, you cannot tolerate a fuel leak or a coolant leak. Your nose is probably going to tell you if you've got a fuel leak, but you should look at all of the fuel lines and be aware of certain cars that have more fuel issues. You probably won't see it at HPDE, but D-Jetronic cars are kind of prone to fuel leaks because there's a lot of rubber fuel lines. And if you end up with a D-Jetronic car, you will want to take a very close look at all of your fuel lines. There's certain Porsches that have fuel lines that crack and leak onto the exhaust manifold and cause fires. And if you're dealing with one of those cars, you really want to pay a lot of attention to those particular fuel lines over the top of the engine. The picture I've brought up here is a coolant leak, and you don't see any coolant, but what you see is the white dots, the white spots that result from the coolant being sprayed out and then evaporating. And so this was a tip-off that I had a coolant leak at this fitting. I ended up changing this hose actually last week. So look around for white spots like this. It's a good tip-off of coolant leaks, and you don't want a coolant leak. Now, I will mention also that I have seen on 3 different occasions with AMG cars, the first time they're on the track, I've seen them have a a leak on the radiator where the aluminum section was joined to the plastic tank. And I think about it this way, Mercedes are generally designed so that the coolant temperature will be about 80 degrees C on the street. And at 80 degrees C, there's almost no pressure in the radiator. I mean, you could run it with the expansion tank cap off, and it doesn't boil or anything at 80 degrees C. Get on the track, they usually run a little hotter, maybe 100 degrees C, 110 degrees C. Using antifreeze suppresses the boiling point, but the pressure is still higher than it would have been at the typical 80 degrees C. And it may be the first time in a long time that the coolant system is seeing anything other than almost ambient pressure. And so the first time out, maybe they'd be a little bit more prone to leaking than, the second or third time. You might, not a part of the checklist, but the first time taking the car out, you might want to do a coolant pressure test before you go out. You might want to have your mechanic do that and just see if there's anything that's going to be prone to leakage on the track. You'd really rather find this in the garage than on the track. Okay. So while you're in the engine compartment, you're going to want to look at the belt or the belts. Most of today's cars have a serpentine belt. You want to shine a flashlight on that and see if it's cracking or worn. And here's a picture of a serpentine belt that looked a little weird. And this one just had a raised area in here. And this edge looked kind of funny too. So that made me a little suspicious. And I pulled the belt off and the pulley was broken. And it's actually a really cheap pulley, although the bolt is so long, it's a little bit hard to change. But you have to be a little suspicious of things that don't quite look right. You also listen for belt squeal or unusual noises, which will tip you off to the belt tension or not having enough tension. And everybody's checklist seems to have something about the accelerator linkage, even though most cars don't have accelerator linkages or throttle cables like they used to. But if you have one, you can see it, you ought to check it. And they usually say check throttle return spring. I threw this picture in because on a 208, this is the throttle cable, and it goes to an encoder that tells the computer what you've asked for. And there's actually a spring on this, and you can actually check to see whether the throttle return is okay or not. Most cars, you can't even see anything like this. In that case, it gets marked NA on the checklist. Well, obviously, you're going to check fluid levels. Don't be above the max. Check the transmission fluid also, if you can. That's harder on some of the newer cars, which are really designed so that you almost can't do that. And for AMG M113 engine cars, you might want to check the left side motor mount. Now this motor mount, all that yellowish stuff there, that was the fluid that used to be in the motor mount. Okay, so that was a clue. The other clue on this failed motor mount, this is a hard picture to get, but you see these dents in the hood? I was thinking, how did I get those dents in the hood? I didn't leave a tool sitting on the engine and close the hood. Well, I think I probably dented the hood with the broken motor mount. So I'd say denting the hood is a clue. So the way, and I'm always nervous about doing this test, but the way you actually test this is you put the car in gear, you very, very heavily put your foot on the brake, and then you rev the engine. You do this with the hood open so you can actually see the engine through the crack in the hood and see if the engine tries to jump up. And on really, really bad ones, you can see the engine move a bunch and then you hear it thunk down. And in driving on the track, if you hear a thunk on an abrupt throttle liftoff, that can be an indication. On this car, the other indication was an irregular idle. And the irregular idle was because the engine was moving so much, it was unplugging a vacuum line and causing a vacuum leak. And so if you have an M113 engined car, they tend to eat motor mounts in 25,000 miles of normal street use. and with the track, they eat them faster. I typically will always have a spare motor mount downstairs. Okay, so under the car, we'll go back to this picture. Okay, and it's handy to have a lift when you do this inspection. If you don't have a lift, you can put the car up on 4 jack stands or put the car up on its wheels jacked up off the ground so that you can get a really good look at the bottom of the car. You absolutely have to look at the bottom of the car. Now, in this picture, I have removed the plastic cover from the bottom of the engine so you've got better view. Without that cover removed, you can't see the suspension bushings adequately. So what are you looking for? Well, I mentioned leaks. You're looking for dripping leaks. Leaks that don't drip of power steering fluid or oil are kind of okay, but you can't have leaks that drip and put oil on the track. We'd prefer, of course, no leaks, but I think that's almost unreasonable. Now you're looking at the suspension bushings. Note here you can see these suspension bushings really well. The upper control arm bushings are almost invisible. You can't see them. And on some cars, even visually inspecting the bushings doesn't really tell you whether they're okay or not. Now here's a picture of a failed suspension bushing. You see, this is on a 208. It's a lower control arm bushing. You see the big crack where the rubber is separating from the metal insert, and then another crack in here. And of course, that motivated me to change the control arm. Okay, I'll go back to my picture here. This is a fun picture to take. I had the car up on the lift and I was laying on my back to do these composites. Okay, so we look at front and rear suspension bushings. The rear ones back here. These are relatively easy to see. The others, the 5-link rear suspension, the bushings can be a little hard to see. Some of those are easier to see with the wheel off, and the fuel pump cover obscures one of them. On a 208, you can shine a flashlight back here and see up here adequately. On a 124, the fuel pump cover is much longer, and you pretty much have to take it off to get a good look up in here. The other reason you need to take it off on a 124 or some of those cars is you need to get a really good look at the fuel lines up in here. I had a recent fuel line failure, a leak. Go over to that picture. There's a suspension bushings. I want to show you this fuel line leak. This is a fuel line that has visual cracks all the way around it. And this could be detected by just a visual inspection with a flashlight. But this is a 124, so it's a car that you'd have to take the cover off to be able to see these. But you want to look at these fuel lines. You do not want to find a fuel leak on the racetrack. All right, let's go back a little bit. I'm going to go back over here. Okay, I was talking about suspension bushings. This is an example of a brand new set of suspension bushings. Yeah, this is a good sway bar bushing. This is a flex disc. There's a flex disc at the front of the drive shaft, behind the transmission, and in front of the differential. And you can see the differential in the background. So this is the rear one. And you want to inspect the flex disc for cracking. You can see a crack here on this one and a crack here on this one. So this is in the very early stages of cracking. For street use, I might defer replacing this for a little while. But going to the racetrack, you need to change it. So make sure you look very carefully at the 2 flex discs and inspect for cracking. You also look to see if the shocks are dry. I had one recently. It was a mid-engine car, and the right side rear shock absorber was totally covered with oil to the point where I thought it was an engine oil leak, and I couldn't find any engine oil leak. The car also had a clunk from the right rear, and when I ended up changing the shocks, that shock was just totally shot. I'd never seen anything like it. It had so much oil on the outside of it, and it was all oil from the shock absorber. And so look to see that your shock absorbers are actually dry like they're supposed to be. Okay. And look at the differential to see whether it's leaking. It's not unusual to see leaks from the side pinion seals or from the input shaft seals. And I had an instance on this car where on the track I had leakage from the side seals. And I believe what was happening was the vent, these are vented, and I believe the vent was clogged and it was heating up and not breathing, and it was increasing the pressure and forcing the lubricant out through the seals, even though the seals were okay. And I ended up removing the vent and putting a vent line and tube on it to mitigate that. But you don't want to see leakage. If you do see leakage, then you will certainly want to check to make sure you have enough lubricant in here. Okay, center support bearing is usually on everybody's checklist. You probably can't see the center support bearing on most cars, and I would not do any disassembly to go look at a center support bearing. If you hear rumbling or a clunking noise from the middle of the car, that's probably center support bearing. Barring that, I wouldn't go off and take things apart to get to that. You've got to pay close attention to the CV joints. This is a cut CV joint. Your tip-off might be a line of grease all the way radially out that it's thrown out. And, when you have a cut CV joint, all the grease gets thrown out and then it destroys CV joint. So you've got to take care of this early before it destroys it. And here is one that I have changed. You also have to pay attention to the tightness of these bolts. I usually mark my bolts to see if they are moving on me or not. And then this is just a shot of the fuel lines looking forward with the cover in place. You can see the fuel lines well enough to know that they're not leaking on this particular car. And for the exhaust, well, clearly you want to make sure that there's no leaks in the exhaust, but also make sure the hangers are all there. When I first got this car, this hanger was just plain missing. And, given the stresses that you're putting on the car on the track, you've got to make absolutely certain that all the exhaust hangers are there. And I'll point out too, most tracks require some muffling. So, I had to put a muffler on this car. It originally did not have one. Okay, I'm going to come out of screen sharing here. Okay, there we go. And back to my notes. Okay, so this is probably a good time for questions, and I've got some miscellaneous stuff I want to go over.
Yeah, not too many questions, more comments.
Okay. Yeah, well, Mel mentions tire. Yeah, you certainly don't want to be on old tires. The guidance on tires is just even for street use, 6 years, you start looking at them really, really closely. In 10 years, you throw them away. And so for track use, certainly you've got to at least use those rules, if not a little bit more, more stringent. Let's see. Rod mentions he bought aftermarket wheels with cone seats instead of ball seats, and the length seemed to need to be different. Yeah, you've got to get the right lug bolts for the wheels that you have. Mercedes tends to be a little different than others. Replacing motor mounts on C43 AMG with 60,000 miles on it, very expensive with 4MATIC, I can imagine. 60,000 miles is not a bad distance though. David asked, I've known in regards to brake fluid not to use racing type in your daily driver, that if you take your car to the car occasionally change it. Yeah, your issue really is that racing brake fluid tends to be more hygroscopic than street brake fluid, although the wet boiling points are still pretty high. And it probably also doesn't have the same type of corrosion inhibitors in it that a regular street brake fluid does. So it's not recommended to just always use racing brake fluid in the car. Although honestly, that's what I do. But because I've got a dedicated track car that gets driven on the street not that much, and it just keeps racing brake fluid in it all the time. But if you're going to have a car that goes to the track frequently, the brake fluid gets changed frequently, and so that mitigates the issues of using racing brake fluid, the lack of corrosion inhibitors and the hygroscopic nature of it. Rod, okay, he says he has a W210, and when he'd lift it by the body and the rear wheels hung down, you could see the rear subframe bushings pulled apart. Yep, that's very indicative of a problem with the subframe bushings. 107s are very bad about that. When you lift the front 107s, you can often see the front subframe bushings falling apart. You know, 109s, you actually want to support the 109 6.3s, you want to support the subframe before you lift it up, because they will just eat new bushings up. Oh, Rusty's with us. Yeah, Rusty said his E63 went through motor mounts after 30,000 miles. Yeah, that's not unusual. The engines make lots of torque, and if you think about the direction that the engine turns, it's going to lift the left side of the engine up, and that's a lot more stress on the motor mount than the right side, which gets compressed all the time, and it will tear the motor mount. That's just one of the things that we that we go through with these high horsepower cars. And Rusty does mention a CV joint repair place, which is where I'm going to send some, because sometimes some of the inner CV joints you can usually just take off and repair. The outers are a lot harder to do, and it might just make sense to send them off to have them all done. Okay, so let me get back to some of the miscellaneous items I wanted to cover. And I think I can come out of screen sharing here.
Well, you are out of screen sharing.
Okay, good. Yeah, I have a good indication of that. Okay, thank you. Miscellaneous, inspect the seat belt. You don't want to see any fraying or any damage. You want to make sure the retractor actually works. I mean, it's really irritating to sit down in the car and not be held tightly in the seat. And I mean, I've had to take seat belts apart and clean them just to make sure the retractor works properly. I mentioned the equal restraint. Every organization has that rule. I mentioned the time requirements for harnesses for some organizations, and that's kind of new. I think that's new for PCA this year, that they're requiring 5 years or less of age for harnesses. And a subtlety with R129s, if the seatbelt warning light is on, since R129s, the shoulder harness is terminated in the seat back. So they have a system of micro switches that tells you whether or not the seat back isn't latched properly. And so that's a safety issue. You know, if the seat back isn't latched fully, then the shoulder harness isn't fully secured. And so if you have a 129 with a seatbelt warning light on, you've got to make sure that the seatbelt or the seat back is properly latched. And I had to troubleshoot one of those, and it was just lubricating a micro switch to make sure that warning light would go off. Now, everybody requires your brake lights to work. The PCA one I did for this weekend said at least one brake light works. For MBCA, I think all 3 brake lights ought to work, you know, if your car has 3 brake lights. Now, how do you check the brake lights if you're alone? Well, I've got a fairly tall mirror that I stand up behind the car and push on the brakes and look at the brake lights. If you have a white garage door, you just parking the car very close to the garage door and pushing on the brakes, the lume from the brake lights are easy to see, and you can easily identify which one's which. Doors should open from inside and the outside. That is not on our checklist, but I'm probably going to add it because it really is required. The doors should open from the inside and the outside. And the windows need to work. You need to be able to run the windows down. Most organizations require that you run with windows down. We're going to allow you at a hot event, you know, midsummer event like the one we're doing for Star Summit Birmingham on the 28th of July. We're going to allow you to run with windows up and the AC on. And we're going to use turn signals for the passing signals, just in consideration that it'll be fairly hot. So let's talk about a few things about the form that I've seen some confusion about. On the form, there is a place under brakes, and it used to say brake dust shields removed, and we added in aftermarket brake dust shield removed. I had a participant in one of our driver's eds that was about to have her dealership remove the inner splash shields, the shields that are between the rotor and the inside of the car. It's not the intent to remove those. What we were talking about with this is the dust shields that some folks put on between the wheel and the rotor that stop brake dust from getting out on the wheel. Concourse people do that. You see them on 107s, you see them on 129s some. You can probably see why that would be a bad thing for the track, because it stops air from circulating and will allow your brakes to overheat too much. And my recommendation is, if you ever have a car with those brake dust shields, take them off and throw them away as soon as you get the car. But certainly you can't run on the track with those. And so that's on our checklist to check that they're gone. And especially for an older car, you might want to take a test drive in the car and feel the brakes, see if the brakes really feel right. Does the suspension feel tight? Are there clunks? Clunks in the suspension or thunks from the engine are some indicators that something's not quite right. And excessive vibration's an issue, especially with the brakes. You want to excessive vibration of the brakes at a minimum is very distracting and can be indicative of a braking issue, especially with warped rotors or something like that. And that doesn't mean go out and rip around the streets for a test drive. Just drive moderately. You can see the things that you need to see just by driving moderately. Okay, any more questions? Okay, got it. So just to conclude, look at the tech inspection form as soon as, or maybe even before you sign up, to make sure that your car can pass the tech inspection. I had one of these once where the tech inspection had windshield wipers functional on it, and the car I was taking did not have windshield wipers. And so I contacted the event organizer, and it turned out they didn't care. But so things like that can potentially trip you up depending on how much of a pain the organization is going to be. We're not a pain, but we do certainly require that you do this tech inspection. And in any organization, you're not going to be allowed on the track without the form. So make sure you get it done, and make sure you bring it to the track. And best off that you do it early so that you can, if you have any surprises, you can get them fixed. Don't be afraid to ask questions to the organizer before the event. I'm really glad the person that was going to have the splash shields taken off asked me beforehand, because that would have been expensive. And of course, bring the form to the track. I've honestly seen people show up not knowing that they needed to do the tech inspection. And the description of these events in every one of the organizations I've ever seen says you have to do that. So, that should not be a surprise. All right, so I'm ready for any other questions you all might have. Let me drop down so I can actually see you. Okay, questions?
You can just unmute if you want to have a question.
Yeah, you can unmute. We can or use the raise hand feature if you want now. We don't need to use chat if you don't want to. Does anyone have any questions? Have I covered things well enough? Everyone's really quiet. Okay. I mean, I'm here. I'll stay as long as you want to talk. But my intent here is to just kind of demystify this. I when I was taking the car to other people to do tech inspections, I really kind of thought that was a bit of a pain. And so I wanted to make it a little bit less of a pain for you all. And that's one reason we'll let you take your own car, as long as you feel like you're technically competent to do that. I mean, it's your safety,
Does a car have to be registered?
Does a car have to be registered? Well, yeah, it's really supposed to be registered. We really are expecting you to have registration and liability insurance on the car. Now, if you wanted to bring a car to one of our events that wasn't, talk to me. So we might very well be able to work something out. What kind of car are you thinking about?
I wasn't thinking about any specific car. I was just curious if people had such dedicated race cars that they don't run them on the road and then they bring them.
Yeah, I have one of those. Yeah, people do that.
That does happen. Jim Roberts, you're on there. I mean, he belongs to the Lotus Club, and a lot of those guys have just, I call them weekend racers, Ricky Racer cars.
Yeah, and in some cases, dedicated race cars makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of compromises that you do for the track that aren't so great for the street. And so, dedicated race car is kind of neat. I mean, the car that I take to the track most of the time is licensed, registered, and insured for the street, but it's got a lot of negative camber. It's really stiff. It's quite low. It's uncomfortable. It's not so awful on the track, but it's uncomfortable to drive on the street. So it's some of the compromises you make for the track.
Do you want to talk more about MB Star diagnostics and WIS and working on your own vehicle, servicing your own vehicle?
Well, what in particular would you like me to talk about? It's a pretty big topic.
Well, I started to look them up here while we were on this chat, and there's some pretty expensive propositions, solutions.
I mean, if you were to buy what the dealer uses, it's like $25,000. What I got was about $600 from essentially a Chinese knockoff. The system doesn't run on a modern laptop, and so what I got included an older laptop that I think is on XP or something like that, and it runs pretty well on XP. But so there's other ways to buy it. You can buy it with like a hard drive and bring your own laptop. If you're really computer illiterate enough to install the hard drive and make it work that way, you can do that. And I mentioned the CDs with the workshop information system, and that runs pretty much on XP or the older systems. And the ones I've seen, everyone I've ever had does an emulator of an older machine. And so you might be running Windows 10 or Windows 11, and it'll run it'll start up a Windows XP emulator, and it'll pretend like it's Windows XP, and that allows you to open the workshop information system. It can be a little clunky, but since it doesn't run on Windows 10, that's really about your only choice.
Okay.
But it runs a lot better on a dedicated Windows XP machine.
Okay.
Got a question here in chat from Francis. Can you comment on the use of silicone-based brake fluid for non-ABS cars?
I don't think anybody's using silicone based brake fluid anymore. It's it was supposed to be the wonderful thing when it first came out, but the advantage of it is it really doesn't allow any corrosion, and so for a car that's going to be in long-term storage, it's probably a good solution. But it did not give good pedal feel, and so I really don't think folks use it on the track at all. In my opinion, it's something to stay away from. I mean, there's just so many wonderful choices of racing brake fluid that's probably not one you want to use. Okay. So are y'all all motivated to go out and go to a track event now? I hope. I'm going this weekend.
Maybe just a commercial for your next Zoom meeting.
Yeah, two things to mention. Of course, the next HPDE 101 will be March 26th, and that's really going to be a classroom session. Some of you that have been to our events have seen a typical classroom session, but I encourage you to come anyway, because I'll certainly be glad to answer any questions. And we're also going to have both a MBCA Driving Academy and an MBCA Performance Driving Academy in association with Star Summit Birmingham, which is in July. And the performance driving part, that is the HPDE, is on the 28th of July, a Monday, at Talladega Grand Prix Raceway, which is a track I just love. And we're going to do the MBCA, the driving skills, defensive driving at the Talladega Oval, using part of the back straight and part of the front straight. We'll do ABS training, some autocross type things, brake ball turn, you know, and that'll give you a completion certificate that should actually lower your insurance cost for the road. So I certainly encourage you to come to that event. That event will have factory tours in it and a dinner and concourse and things like that too. It's going to be another great event. Questions? And for those of you that are signed up for the submarine tour, it moved to the 3rd of June. Totally off topic. Other questions? Okay. No other questions. I'll stay as long as you want, honestly. I'll tell you how I was working on air conditioning today.
Wrap it up.
Okay. Anyway, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And if you ever have a question about HPD, give me a call. Send me a note. Glad to answer. I want to encourage folks to do, you know, HPDE. I think it's an area that we just haven't promoted enough in the club or done enough in the club. And I think it's really a good direction for us. And plus you become a better driver and it's fun.
One last question. Do you recommend a dedicated HPD car?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're going to do. It depends how often you're going to do it. I mean, if you're going to go off every weekend and do it, you know, maybe that's the right thing to do. Depends how many cars you have. I mean, if you can afford to do that or not. If you're only going to do it, you know, once or twice a year, no. 3 or 4 times a year, maybe. Every month, probably. Kind of depends. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of choices. I mean, mine, yeah, I did this quest for the cheapest AMG car, and that's how I ended up with a CLK 55. Actually, I have a couple of CLK 55s, and they're kind of, it's really a neat car with a big engine, and it's relatively inexpensive, and it's a lot of fun. The one I got just happened to not have any mufflers or catalytic converters when I bought it either, so it made nice noises. I actually had to put a muffler on it. But then, you know, I've got what 25, 26 cars now, so I can afford to have a dedicated track car. All right. Well, anybody else? All right. Well, I thank you all for coming. Diana, thank you for helping me with this. I really appreciate it. And it's great to see some new faces out there, and encourage you to come back, encourage you to sign up for our events. Oh, I think Bob has his hand up. What's up, Bob?
No.
You're still muted, Bob. Can't hear you. This is Bob Best.
Yeah, he took his raised hand down.
Took his hand down. Okay. Anybody else? All right.
Bye-bye.
Time for dinner. Good night.